Part 2 of McCloskey's 1983 article is entitled "The Official Methodology of Economics is Modernist." So here we've got McCloskey's going to survey the ground and in particular identify the chief characteristics of the enemy. So McCloskey says that modernist scientific method in economics is an amalgam of logical positivism, behaviorism, operationalism, and the hypothetico-deductive model of science. Logical positivism became popular in the philosophy of science in the first half of the 20th century. It wasn't really a philosophy of science per se at the start. It was really a kind of, its core was kind of a theory of meaning, which basically said that meaningful statements were either purely logical or mathematical statements, or analytical statements, or alternatively, they were synthetic or factual statements. And those synthetic or factual statements ultimately had to be reduced to statements of sensation. They were of sense experience. These were the only two types of statements which could be said to be meaningful. So 1 + 1 = 2 is a mathematical statement. Triangles have 3 sides is an analytical statement. And then we have the factual statement. So this table is made of wood, or this chair is made of steel, something like that. These are synthetic or factual statements, and they're a meaningful factual statement in the sense that it can be reduced to a sense experience on my part. I can have a direct experience of these entities in the world. So the implication of that is that any statement which is not a purely logical or mathematical statement and is not a factual statement that can be reduced to sense experience is simply not a meaningful statement. For example, God is good is not true or false. It's just not meaningful. Okay. So there you got logical positivism. So logical positivism kind of extends into a philosophy of science in the sense that whenever you make factual claims about the world, they have to be based on experience. And you seek to confirm a theory by experience of the world. You could also show that the theory is false by experience of the world as well, perhaps. Okay. Then we've got behaviorism. Behaviorism is actually a term that comes from, well, was popularized anyway in psychology in the 1950s, especially by B.F. Skinner, but there were others before that, Watson, for example. Anyway, behaviorism, the doctrine of behaviorism, or the key doctrine that's relevant here, is that you're interested in studying the behavior of some phenomenon, or for example, some organism. So rats or pigeons or human beings, you're interested in studying their behavior. You're not interested in their internal life, their internal subjective states. You don't have access to them. You don't have direct experience of them in others, and so we ignore them altogether. We're only interested in behaviour. Then we've got operationalism. Operationalism is an aspect of a philosophy of science which was attached to logical positivism. It was established by Percy Bridgman, and operationalism says that the empirical definition of a term should be understood in terms of the operation of measuring it, or the means by which you measure it. If you don't have any means of measuring something, then it really doesn't have an operational definition. Okay, and then we've got a hypothetico-deductive model. So this is where you establish a hypothesis, and the hypothesis should have some kind of general law in it, for the most part. So you establish a hypothesis, you deduce a prediction from that, you test the prediction against the world, that is by observing the world. If the prediction turns out to be true, you say your hypothesis has been confirmed or perhaps corroborated, but it doesn't prove that your hypothesis is true, but it does give you greater confidence in it. If your prediction turns out to be false, as per observations, then you would say that your hypothesis has been falsified. Alright, so there we've got a hypothetico-deductive model of science. Just as an aside, McCloskey uses the term modernism as that's the term designated as the enemy to be combated here. I think McCloskey is taking this term from Booth's book, Modern Dogma and the Rhetoric of Assent, because Booth uses that term as the chief enemy. The other authors who McCloskey cites as inspirations or sources don't use this term modernism to designate the enemy, even though they might all be referring to the same thing. They use different terms. Alright, so what are the 11 precepts that McCloskey identifies? These don't appear to be in any particular order, and there's some overlap between them. But nonetheless, this is as they appear in the article. So the first one is prediction is the goal. Now that's ambiguous itself. That's coming. You'll recall from reading the article by Milton Friedman, The Methodology of Positive Economics, that this is probably where this term is coming from. Prediction is the goal. Strictly speaking, we shouldn't say prediction per se is the goal if we're using a hypothetico-deductive model. What we would say is explanation is the goal, and prediction is the means by which we test whether we're achieving that goal of explanation. But anyway, we should focus on predictions. That's the main point. It's a kind of a criterion by which we judge a theory. 2 observable implications determine the truth of a theory. Okay, so that's coming from the hypothetico-deductive model. Observability entails objective experiments. So if we're talking about when we talk about observability here, we're not just talking about just wandering around looking at the world. Rather, we should attempt to set up experiments. Now in economics we generally or very often can't do that, so experiments here can be interpreted somewhat metaphorically as conditions in which we can hold certain variables constant and we can observe some variable of interest changing and see what effect that has on a dependent variable that we're interested in. Theory is proven false if and only if implications are observed to be false. All we're simply saying here is that say for example the hypothesis, we can definitely say the hypothesis is false if its predictions turn out to be not true as observed. If we don't find that the predictions are false, then we can't say that the hypothesis is false. It doesn't mean the hypothesis is true, but we're kind of, in a sense, logically speaking, we're left with the hypothesis having an indeterminate status. Introspection is not scientific knowledge because it isn't objective. Introspection here is where you reflect on your own thinking and then project that out into the world onto others. So, for example, maybe the real reason economists believe the law of demand is true is because they reflect on their own behaviour. And so when they go out into the world and the price of Mars bars has gone up, they buy fewer Mars bars. And when the price of Coca-Cola goes down, they buy more Coca-Cola. And so on and so forth. That experience, that internal experience of the mental process which has gone on, is then projected out into the world onto others, and you assume everyone else thinks roughly the same thing. So anyway, introspection here is not scientific knowledge because it's not objective. It's what's going on in your head. It's your own thoughts. You thinking about your own thoughts. That's not something which is directly observable in others. That's just your personal subjectivity. So we shouldn't be counting that as evidence of anything. Kelvin's dictum, that is, knowledge is quantifiable. Well, this is basically the idea that in order to truly, quote-unquote, know something, then you should be able to measure it. And in order to measure something, it has to have the attribute of quantity. That is, it has to be quantifiable. Now, as to what quantity actually means, there's actually a lot of debate about that, but let's say one version of it would be to say that it's where you attach numbers to things in the world according to some rule or other. Okay, so that's one definition. That actually comes from a psychologist named Stevens, but another definition would be to say that it's an attribute which has the properties of ordinality and additivity. Alright, so if you can quantify something, if it has a quantity, you can quantify it, and then you can measure it. And this is objective information, and that's what counts as true knowledge. Everything else, qualitative statements, are not insufficiently objective or insufficiently precise to count as knowledge, or perhaps to count as scientific knowledge. Subjectivity enters into the context of discovery only, not into the context of justification. So the context of discovery is when you formulate a hypothesis. So how a hypothesis gets formulated, or how a theory gets formulated or constructed, or where the ideas for it came from, that can come from all sorts of subjective sources. It can become, you just might read material in the literature and start to think, well, I think if we modify it this way and we modify it that way, I think this would make for an interesting theory. That's not really being objective. That's really you working with material that you found, and by a process of imagination and creativity, you put disparate things together and come up with a new theory. Or you might just have some kind of fever dream and come up with a new hypothesis about something. So, and this can include subjectivity here, can include all sorts of things that might go into your decision about, what you think would make for a good hypothesis. So you might say, oh, well, this hypothesis is particularly elegant. So this is an aesthetic criterion or aesthetic judgment on your part that's not really objective in any way. Anyway, so none of that enters into that's fine for coming up with a hypothesis or theory, but it should be, all of those factors should be kept out of the context of justification. That is, the means by which you attempt to establish that your hypothesis is true. So under no circumstances should your feelings about the hypothesis enter into the question of whether the hypothesis can be justified as being true or likely to be true. Your aesthetic judgments about whether you think something is beautiful or simple or clear or anything like that, or neat, is irrelevant to whether the theory is true. It's left out of the question of whether the theory is justified. Okay. Methodology's function is to demarcate science from non-science and to demarcate positive from normative claims. So this is methodology's function. That is, so it's not a description of, it's not an official description of science here, where this is methodology talking about what methodology's job is. So demarcating science from non-science, so we're deciding, yes, this is a scientific discipline, or this is a scientific claim. This other thing, this other statement is not. It's pseudoscience, or it's fake science, or it's just not science at all. It's art, or it's theology, or it's an expression of personal emotions, or something like that. So methodology's job is to come up with rules by which you can divide up these things. Astrology is not science, astronomy is science, okay, and so on. And to demarcate positive from normative claims. So this is like being a police officer here, where the methodologist will say, well, that's a positive claim. That is to say, this is a factual claim about the world, where you're just trying to describe or explain or predict something. But this other statement here is a normative claim. That is, it has moral values built into it. It has an implicit imperative or an implicit prescription built into it. That is, it's trying to tell people what they should do. So the methodologist wants to try and demarcate these kinds of claims and keep them clear and separate from each other, or at least so you're aware of when you are making a positive claim and a normative claim. And by and large, it would generally be thought that positive statements are statements of science, normative statements are non-scientific statements. They are questions of personal morality or aesthetics, or practical political judgments, rather than just trying to describe, explain, or predict the world. Explanations entail covering laws. So when we say we're trying to explain something, we would want to have a hypothesis about why that's occurring, and that hypothesis should have a law in it. So all plants must photosynthesize in order to live. And so we've got a general law, and then we can say that this is a plant, this thing here is a plant, this particular plant is alive, therefore it has not been deprived of sunlight. Fine. But we needed covering laws in there, statements about all plants. Moral and aesthetic values have no place in the justification of positive and objective claims. So that just is something that I've already really said already. So these are moral and aesthetic values are outside the context of justification. They can enter into the context of discovery, but not into the context of justification. And we've got Hume's fork is the last one, and this is that and this is really coming from logical positivism, or logical positivism takes it from Hume, that scientific statements are either analytical, that is logical or definitional, or synthetic, that is factual and observable. Everything else is, well, Hume didn't say everything else is meaningless, but Hume did say everything else, anything that doesn't fall into these categories, you throw that into the flames. So if you were to say that, for example, the whole of the universe is connected by love, that you chuck that into the flames, because that's neither an analytical statement nor is it a synthetic statement. It's not a factual statement that can be backed by observation. All right, so there's McCloskey's list of 11 items which characterize the official methodology of economics. So obviously this is not some kind of coherent doctrine as McCloskey's presented it. It's just things that you tend to find McCloskey says it's things you tend to find economists believe. McCloskey goes on to say, makes an argument from authority. Few in philosophy now believe as many as half of these propositions. A substantial, respectable, and growing minority believes none of them, but a large majority of economics believes them all. In economics believes them all. The main texts, McCloskey says, of modernist methodology in economics are Friedman's 1953 article, The Methodology of Positive Economics, and George Stigler and Gary Becker's 1977 article, De Gustibus Non Est Disputandum. Actually, I think that second one is probably not a major text in the modernist methodology of economics. On the surface, it's making a very specific argument that you shouldn't try to explain market behaviour, in particular the behaviour of buyers, by changes in their tastes. That is, you can explain most market behaviour without having to utilise this particular explanation, that people just change their taste, they change their mind, they like things more, this more than that. And they'd say mainly you can mostly explain things by changes in prices or changes in people's incomes, for example. So it's not really a major methodology article, but Friedman's absolutely is. This is really it's like the little Bible that economics graduates, up until relatively recently, were almost required to read. Sometimes it was the only piece of methodology that was read. Not always, but definitely this was read by the vast majority of economists. And sometimes it was taken on board, as I said in a previous seminar. This essay, Friedman's essay, probably more than any other, is drawn upon, or at least parts of it are drawn upon by economists to defend their theories from critics, especially from critics outside the discipline. Alright, so that's part 2.